Good afternoon, my friends. The sun is shining here in New Jersey, where it is official. You can now smoke marijuana, but you can't grow it, and you definitely can't go to a dispensary without a medical card. So Governor Phil Murphy signed it into law this week. So take a look at what he said.
Within the past hour plus, I signed 3 bills that will fulfill the promise of the constitutional amendment the people of New Jersey overwhelmingly supported 3 months ago by legalizing adult use cannabis and decriminalizing marijuana possession in small amounts, limiting the use of previous marijuana convictions, and creating the carefully regulated cannabis marketplace that can be an economic boon to our state.
Alrighty, folks. So marijuana is legal in the Garden State, and here to break it down for us is our very own cannabis correspondent, Mr. Mike Davis. Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing good. It's been a pretty crazy week, to say the least. But as Governor Murphy, you just heard him say, marijuana is legal. New Jersey is the 13th state, so it's been a pretty exciting week for sure.
Absolutely. Super exciting. And you've been busy on the ground getting us all the news on what is happening. So first and foremost, tell us what's new this week and why it took so long from November to before then to get this out now.
Sure. Jesse, the last time you and I talked was right after Election Day. And, there was a celebratory tone of like, we just legalized marijuana. This is a thing now. And in reality, it really took a couple of months to make that happen. And that's because of the weird way our Constitution works, in which the legislature had to pass those laws that we basically said as voters, we basically told them what to do, and they finally got it done. Things really slowed down right before the end of the year. There was a lot of negotiation back and forth over a lot of things. One big issue was tax revenue. Specifically, there was this idea that the taxes that were included in the ballot question itself just didn't really do enough for social justice. And remember, this was a pretty social justice-driven campaign. But then it really, really slowed down after that. And there was this one issue over how to handle underage marijuana users that really slowed things down for the last 6 weeks or so. But finally, they came to a compromise, and that's why the governor signed the bills on Monday.
Compromise. Now, we were talking earlier, and we have a couple guests who will elaborate a little bit more on that. But can you just touch on what was this compromise? Sure.
So basically, the first version of this bill, this thing that finally got signed into law, was going to hit underage users with fines, essentially. It could be hundreds of dollars. They scaled up and down depending on what version of the bill you were reading. But the compromise they eventually settled on is this, which is basically written warnings, right? So you can get 3 or more if you're somebody underage. The first one is just a written warning. The second one, they'll call your parents, essentially. And then that third one and any subsequent ones, they're going to put you in touch with, community groups who can talk a little bit about substance use and things like that. But here's the big thing that happened sort of the last minute is now underage drinking is a part of this, alcohol as well. And it really came out of nowhere, but the legislature got to a point where this bill was stalling and it wasn't going through. And apparently there was some sense that if underage drinking laws were changed, that maybe that would put it through. And when you think about it, it makes sense, because if you're saying marijuana is legal for anyone 21 older, that sure sounds a lot like alcohol, right? So it makes sense that you would treat underage use of that the same way.
Interesting. Now, there's a lot here to unpack, but I think the biggest question on everyone's mind is, when can I go to a dispensary?
I can tell you that is the number one question I've gotten in emails, tweets, everything. So I would put it at about a year, and that's for a couple of different reasons. I mean, this whole legal weed industry is going to be run by this thing called by the Cannabis Regulatory Commission. That commission hasn't had a meeting yet, let alone they haven't set rules and regulations that things they're going to do. Like hours of operations, rules about security cameras, things like that. And then they got to actually start getting license applications and issuing licenses. So I really think it could be a year. Now, there is sort of a caveat to that, which is that the medical marijuana dispensaries that we have in the state could start selling recreationally if they get state approval. But those dispensaries are dealing with huge supply and demand issues for their patients. I mean, a lot of times there's stories of medical dispensaries closing down for days at a time because they simply run out. So it wouldn't really seem wise to all of a sudden put the strains of the legal recreational market on top of that. So I think that a year is going to be kind of the good benchmark. And that's what we've seen in other states too, who have the ballot question.
All right. Well, maybe a year from now, we'll be able to go to a dispensary and actually do the show from a dispensary. Perhaps. We'll see. Well, let's get the show on the road. Let's bring on some guests. We have Clark Township Municipal Prosecutor J.H. Barr, who's going to talk a little bit about this, kind of the legalities of all of this. How you doing, J.H.?
All right. How are you?
I'm doing good. So let's just get into this. I know Mike was talking a little bit about when I can go to a dispensary, when we can expect to go to a dispensary, but tell us what actually I can do today. What is still illegal?
It depends on how you look at things. The state constitution has been amended to give adults over 21 the right to consume and possess marijuana. But the statute necessary really didn't come into existence until this week. As a practical matter, you cannot purchase marijuana on the street from an unlicensed dealer because there are no licensed dealers yet. And that transaction would be illegal. But once you have marijuana in your possession, it's really, there's nothing that law enforcement could do to stop you.
Thanks for that answer, JH. I know that's another big question we've been getting a lot this week. So I want to ask you, there's been a lot of talk in the campaign leading up to the ballot question that legalizing marijuana was going to free up waste. You know, the estimates are somewhere over $120 million. I mean, you're a municipal prosecutor. You used to be the head of the State Municipal Prosecutors Association. Does that sound right? Has this really been like a huge waste, a huge time suck for municipal prosecutors?
Absolutely.
Can you
absolutely? If you look at,
go ahead, JH.
Sure. If you look at the calendar of many municipal prosecutors, especially in suburban urban areas, you'll see over the past several years, a disproportionate amount of our time has been occupied by marijuana cases. And people need to realize when an arrest is made for marijuana possession, the police have to take the actual marijuana joint or bag of weed or whatever it is, and it has to be put into an evidence locker and then transmitted to a lab where it would be tested so that a report could be issued by the lab showing that the substance is in fact marijuana. Very consuming and an expensive process. And there has been such a flood, deluge of marijuana samples inundating our state crime labs that we municipal prosecutors have been unable to get timely lab reports, and people's cases were really languishing in the municipal courts with prosecutors unable to complete the case and defendants charged upset that their cases are staying open indefinitely. This legalization will end that once and for all.
Yeah, it certainly seems like a pretty common theme that this has been one particular area where a whole lot of resources have been devoted, and it's a chance for those resources to go elsewhere. So I want to ask you, JH, I mean, one of the big changes here is how the use of smell of marijuana, burnt or raw, could be used, specifically with probable cause. For our audience, can you explain what that actually means?
What's remarkable about the new law, and candidly, I think it's a little excessive in my opinion, but the bottom line is the odor of marijuana has a distinct odor. It has a distinct odor both in its raw form and in its burnt form. That those odors are no longer the basis for a police officer to initiate a search of someone in an effort to try to root out evidence of a crime. So that odor, which has traditionally been the main reason police would initiate searches, is simply removed from the ability of a police officer to investigate crime. In my view, it goes a little far because I think that the odor of burnt marijuana in a motor vehicle suggests that the occupants are using marijuana while in the vehicle, and that, in my view, should be investigated at a minimum like a type of open container of alcohol, which is still illegal to have. But I would agree that the odor of raw marijuana in a motor vehicle poses no public safety threat.
And that's a really good point. And now you're bringing out kind of, this new rule, kind of this new change in the legalities. And I want to ask you if you think, this bill or these new rules are going to be changed down the line. Do you think this is concrete? Is there going to be wiggle room? What can we expect?
That's a great question. And I candidly do think there will be some tightening of these rules going forward. it's just going to take one tragedy involving right now underage use, as Mike alluded to earlier. It's a rather light penalty for underage possession or use of marijuana right now. If somebody gets really hurt or sick who's underage as a result of that, there's no doubt the legislature is going to increase penalties or tighten up the situation, and that could happen with the motor vehicle operation as well. I don't see an immediate public safety threat with the odor of burnt marijuana no longer being a basis for a search, but I could see it somewhere in the future. Maybe a life could have been saved if the odor of burnt marijuana would have permitted a police officer to stop someone from driving away.
That makes a lot of sense. JH, thank you so much for your time. It's been great having you here. One last thing I want to throw at you. You're a lifelong Republican. This is a pretty bipartisan issue. Tell me a little bit about being a Republican supporting marijuana legalization, because, I don't know if a lot of people realize that it's pretty bipartisan at this point.
I've always said that we Republicans are against the wasteful spending of taxpayer dollars on government programs that do not work and are not necessary. The war on marijuana has been a government program that did not work and was not necessary. Therefore, my support of legalization was entirely consistent with my political ideology. We're in a better place overall, even though I don't agree with all of the aspects of New Jersey's legalized marijuana law. We are definitely in a better place this week than we were last week. And that's why in November, while President Biden and Senator Booker won New Jersey by about 60% of the vote, marijuana legalization won 67% of the vote. And that means there's a lot of Republicans like myself who agree that it's our approach to dealing with marijuana.
Absolutely. Bipartisan support, and there's still more work to be done. JH, thank you so much for your work and for being on with us today.
So you saw before Governor Murphy announced that he had signed the bills into law. We're going to show you a clip now of Governor Murphy talking a little bit about the ramifications this means for the social justice of this state going forward.
As of this moment, New Jersey's broken and indefensible marijuana laws, which permanently stained the records of many residents and short-circuited their futures, and which disproportionately hurt communities of color and failed the meaning of justice at every level, social or otherwise, are no more. In their place are laws that will usher in a new industry based on equity and will reinvest dollars into communities. Laws which promote both public health by promoting safe cannabis products and public safety by allowing law enforcement, to focus their resources on serious crimes. And yes, we are fulfilling the will of the voters by allowing adult use cannabis while having in place common sense measures to deter its use among kids.
Alrighty, folks. So we now have the executive director of the ACLU, Mr. Amol Sinha. How are you, Amol?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me. How are you both?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. I think Mike is good too.
Yeah, hanging in there. It's been a busy week, I know, for you too as well.
Super busy week. And now, Amol, tell us a little bit about, one, how busy this was, but then also how big this news is for New Jersey.
Well, this week was certainly busy, but the past several months have been exhausting. We at the ACLU have been working nights, weekends, what have you, to make sure that we legalize marijuana and we do it the right way. We, in fact, have been working on this issue for 7 years. And the last year, through the ballot question, which we led the campaign for, along with a lot of partners through NJCAN 2020, and then the legislative drafting piece of it has been just monumental amounts of work. The reason this is a historic moment in New Jersey is not simply because we legalized marijuana, but because we did it in a way that values and centers racial justice. The whole reason for our involvement at the ACLU for this campaign and through New Jersey United for Marijuana Reform was to make sure that we undo the harms of the war on drugs and try to remedy the problems that people have been experiencing, the collateral consequences that people have been experiencing for years and years and years as a result of a simple marijuana arrest or conviction.
Amol, you mentioned, I mean, you chaired the NJ Can 2020 campaign, and, unlike a lot of states, that social justice movement, it worked, and it was very popular. Now that these bills are signed into law, I mean, it's safe to say those goals have been achieved. I mean, we are in a much better place than we were 2 weeks ago.
We are, and, I have to say that, that as the ACLU, our job is never done. We are happy with the way things turned out, but we're never completely satisfied. We still in this bill are missing key provisions, including HomeGrow, which is makes us an outlier because every other state that has legalized has some form of HomeGrow in its scheme. We still encourage some degree of law enforcement interaction with youth, which I think, while we are in a much better place dealing with youth right now than the status quo, which was to arrest kids and to put them in the criminal legal system, we are still, having law enforcement interact with kids. And we know that whenever there's law enforcement interaction, that has the potential to escalate and lead to tragic outcomes the way we've seen so often in Black and brown communities across the United States. So there's still that thing there. But there are several good things in this bill that I wanted to uplift before I talk too much about the things that are missing. First, tax revenue is going to impact zones, those communities that have been hardest hit by the war on drugs. We're going to see 100% of the social justice excise tax and 70% of sales tax going to those communities. Second, we have probably the most progressive decriminalization scheme in the country, where up to 6 ounces of cannabis possessed by an individual will be decriminalized. And not only will those people not face any criminal penalties, they won't face any civil penalties as well, which we know can be a backdoor into the criminal justice system when you fail to pay your fine or whatever that might be. And that's inextricably intertwined with race in our country and disproportionately impacts Black and brown folks. So those are some really good pieces in this bill that in these 3 bills that I think will set a model for the rest of the country on how to legalize.
Amol, you mentioned something I wanted to bring up, which is HomeGrow. Why is that so important? I mean, maybe explain to our viewers. And why do you think it got held up that it's not a part of this? I mean, like you mentioned, it's a pretty progressive decriminalization bill. That law hasn't changed. You're still facing 3 to 5 years if you get caught growing as few as 1 marijuana plant.
Yeah, and there are severe penalties attached with HomeGrow. There are mandatory minimums attached with HomeGrow if you do it after beyond a certain amount. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know why it got held up. I don't know why it's been a non-starter in our state. But what I can say is that it makes us an outlier in New Jersey. And it's an issue of racial justice because it's an issue of economic justice. And as I mentioned, those 2 things are inextricably intertwined. We have a state where, and during a pandemic especially, where we have people that lack mobility. Right. There are people that can't get to the places where they need to go in order to get, legal cannabis or even their medical cannabis. So to have HomeGrow would mean that people would be able to grow their own strains for personal use, and people who are either immobile or priced out of the market would be able to have access to this legal product, if they were able to grow their own. And that we know is going to impact poor people with disabilities, and Black and brown people in a different way than it does white folks or wealthy folks or people who are able-bodied.
So for those of you keeping score at home, you can smoke it, you cannot buy it, and you cannot grow it. Amol, I wanted to ask you also, we've got a lot of questions about expungement because, this was part of that 2019 bill package that didn't go through. That was the only one that did go through in 2019. But there's also some language here. So if I'm somebody with this on my record, what's the process of getting that record cleared? Is it automatic? I mean, what's the step like? And why is it better now than it was?
So previously, the way to get let me start over. There are a whole bunch of crimes that are eligible for expungement in New Jersey, right? Some of them have waiting periods, some of them have lengthy, time periods between the end of your sentence and when you'll be eligible for expungement. But there are a whole bunch of crimes that are eligible for expungement. Previously, what an individual who wanted to get the record expunged would have to do, say I was that individual, what I would have to do is send through certified mail a filing to every institution that could have been involved in my arrest and conviction. So that means the municipal police, the municipal prosecutor, the county prosecutor, the state attorney general's office, the state judiciary, the administrative office of the courts. Every single step of the way, I would have to file paperwork. And that gets expensive and it gets burdensome. And even the judiciary, the administrative office of the courts, will tell you that you're better off hiring an attorney to walk you through that process because it is so overly complicated. Now, with the passage of the bill last year, the expungement bill that passed last year and was signed into law, they've created an online portal where folks can go to this. I wish I had the link on me right now, where folks can go to the state website for expungements and start the process. And all of that communication that needed to happen with the different agencies would happen behind the scenes. And they wouldn't have to individually contact each individual agency. What we're aiming for is an automated process where folks would be able to, where the judiciary would just be able to say, Amol Sinha was charged with possession of marijuana under an ounce or whatever their threshold is, and he will now be clear of that record and would automatically expunge that record with a notice going to me, but without me having to lift too much of a finger in getting that process started. So we're in a much better place now, and we're headed to an even better place in the future if all goes well. But things take time, and the materialization of good policy takes some time, and of course there's going to be some kinks in the process that we're going to need to figure out. But we're keeping an eye on it as the ACLU. We're in touch with the governor's office and the attorney general's office and all of the different folks that are involved to make sure that it happens smoothly.
Great. Now, so overall, we are the 13th state to legalize this. And I mean, on the East Coast, we're the 4th and the 1st in our mid-Atlantic, corridor. Now, on a national level, how important is it that New Jersey legalize this?
It's hugely important. Let me first talk about the regional level. It's important regionally because we are right in between Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and New York City, right? And so once we have legalized, I'm sure the other states around us are going to legalize as well. And as you know, Pennsylvania and New York are highly densely populated and have a lot of people that are neighboring to New Jersey. Secondly, it's important on a national level because I believe that we are the most diverse state to legalize in the country, and we are, we have one of the biggest proportion of residents of color. We have one of the biggest proportions of immigrants in the country, and that's a huge deal because doing it in Colorado or Vermont is one thing, but when you have a state like New Jersey that touts racial justice in its legalization scheme while having the biggest proportion of people of color, or one of the biggest proportions of people of color in the country, that's a different vibe, right? Like we're doing something a little bit different here. But that also means that we're trying to course correct for our racist history in our state in some ways, because we have the worst black to white ratio in incarceration in the country, right? Like we have, you're 12 times more likely to be incarcerated in New Jersey if you're black than if you're white. And so I hope that we're taking steps that can be a model for the country, where we're not only just legalizing, which is certainly going to have a racial justice impact, but we're doing so with that history and that centering of racial justice in mind every step of the way. It's not just an ancillary thing that there's going to be a racial justice impact. It's front and center every step of the way. So I think it sends a message to the rest of the country. this is how you do it. And for states that are thinking about it, like New York, like Pennsylvania, and the broader region and country, we hope that folks who have diversity in their states don't shy away from legalization because they don't want to grapple with that racist past that they may experience or may have experienced in their existence.
Absolutely. Amol, you said it best, and this is, again, big news overall, nationally and here in our home state. Mike, do you have any more questions for Amol?
I'll just say, I know the ACLU has been a part of this from the beginning, and I'm sure Amol's had a very long couple of years, so we'll just let him go and say thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Amol. Alrighty, folks at home. Well, thanks so much for tuning in with us. It's been a journey to get here. I think you'd agree, right, Mike?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I've loved covering this story from day one, and the story doesn't end here. I'm going to keep covering it as this industry gets figured out, as, you heard about all these changes that might have to happen to these laws at some point. But, myself, Jesse, the Asbury Park Press, NorthJersey.com, the Bergen Record, we'll be there every step of the way.
Absolutely. And again, thanks, folks, for tuning in with us. We are signing off for the day.